you very much for inviting me. It's nice to be with you all again, even though I'm 2,000 miles away. And one of these days, I hope that I can get on out there and see the Philatelic Library. But in the meantime, this is about the best I can do. As I was mentioning, this is the building that you see on the screen is the home of the Railway Mail Service Library. One of the interesting aspects is not only was it a railroad station, but it was a post office for the town of Boyce for about 20 years until they built a new post office. That was from 1955 till about 1983. You see the two sets of windows with a door followed by two sets of window over on the left. That was where the post office was. The entrance to the post office and the lock boxes were on the opposite side of the building, which was the parking lot. Not only did it have a railroad background, it had a postal history background as a post office. And of course, the mail coming for Boyce arrived for many decades on the Hagerstown and Roanoke Railway Post Office. And then in later years, that was shifted over to a highway post office. So it's seen all sorts of mail transportation. For this reason, it is a very, very appropriate home for the Railway Mail Service Library. So we'll get on into it. I'm going to explain. This presentation is going to be a little different because I'm going to talk about what the Railway Mail Service was and the functions of a railway post office, just so that you have an appreciation of that. I've sent out a PDF file that includes all the pages and all the notes for the pages in this presentation. In there are the three subtopics: the description of schedules of mail routes, description of distribution schemes, and using schedule and scheme information. From a library perspective, I don't know if the Rocky Mountain Philatelic Library has a significant number of these publications, but as postal historians, it's always important to use primary source material for doing postal history research. And that leads us to the last one that's in white that we will talk about. That's really the focus of this presentation, is how you can document a real photo postcard and learn more about it and take a moment frozen in time. By the way, the name of this presentation, Maybe Snow Will Stay These Couriers from the Swift Completion of Their Appointed Rounds. Of course, Herodotus said, neither snow nor rain nor heat nor gloom of night will stay these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds. And he was talking about messengers and not necessarily a post office service, but that's sort of been the slogan for the Post Office Department and the Postal Service for many decades. And appears on the General Post Office building at 8th and 33rd Streets in New York City, which has recently been converted to a train station. So what goes around comes around. So we'll talk about the Railway Mail Service first, and this is an Eagle badge. They were issued in 1899. There's really no logo for the Railway Mail Service, but the badge is about the closest thing you can get to it because it was the official identification of a railway postal clerk. And they were worn proudly, even when you had the last railway post office between New York and Washington, and the clerks had been issued photo identification badges that became used in the 1960s. They still wore their badges. It was a source of pride. And of course, in 1949, I think it was, they changed from Railway Mail Service to Postal Transportation Service, but all the badges are numerically sequential. So they started with badge number 1 in 1899. The first 10,000 badges were issued, about 1,000 badges each to each of the divisions that existed at that time. I believe there were 10. So then after that, they reordered badges as they had more clerks starting to work. And so the numbers go up to something around 97,000. That doesn't mean that there are only 97,000 railway postal clerks or mobile unit clerks or postal transportation clerks that ever worked. But because badges, when they were turned in, they were reissued. So, maybe double that amount. But That's the nice thing about these badges is they're sequentially numbered, and therefore you can come up with a pretty good guess how old a badge is just by the sequence of its serial number. So the Railway Mail Service, now there's an experimental route in 1862 between Hannibal and St. Joseph, Missouri. That was on the Hannibal and St. Joseph Railroad, which later was owned by the Burlington route, the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy. It lasted about 8 months. And the reason why I don't view it as necessarily the beginning of the railway mail service, it was certainly an important step towards that, was, as far as I understand it, sorted mail in one direction going from Hannibal to St. Joseph. They were primarily separating out the mail that was going to make the connection to the Butterfield Overland stage. This is after the Pony Express had expired. Now, just one interesting side note about this route. There's a fellow named Harvey, which is associated with the Santa Fe Railroad and the Harvey houses. Well, he was a mail clerk on the Hannibal and St. Joseph, and I guess he had an idea that the kinds of places where he was eating was pretty lousy. So he decided to go out and start setting up restaurants, and eventually, under the umbrella of doing them for the Santa Fe Railroad, had an extensive network of the eateries at stations as well. I believe the some of the dining cars were actually managed by Harvey's chains. So that was a very interesting sidelight. And the first permanent route was established on August 28th, 1864. That one's burned in my memory because that's when George B. Armstrong told the Assistant Postmaster General that he felt that they could utilize mail space on cars and sort mail while it was moving. And they were sorting for towns along the way, and they were sorting in both directions. And this was a permanent route. It was established on that date, and that marked also the beginning. They created an office called the Railway Mail Service under the Second Assistant Postmaster General, where it stayed basically its whole time until 1960. And that was really the beginning of the Railway Mail Service. And of course, the final run on June 30th, 1977, between New York and Washington was the railway post offices. So that, in a nutshell, is the railway post office history. There was a renaming of the Railway Mail Service to Postal Transportation Service in 1949, and that occurred because back when the Railway Mail Service was established, you did not have competing modes of transportation. You did have some boats operating on inland rivers and lakes that were under the jurisdiction of the Railway Mail Service. Some were named railway post offices, even though there were no tracks and wheels underneath the boats. Technically, the last railway post office was not the New York and Washington. It was the Lake Winnipesaukee RPO that lasted a year longer to 1978, September 30th, 1978, and was discontinued. Now, the boat still operates on Lake Winnipesaukee. It was a boat named the Sophie C, but they took away the postmarker and they didn't really sort mail on there. It was made up pouches that went to a couple post offices that were along the lake, such as Dollar Island and Bear Island, I think was another one. So anyway, Postal Transportation Service transitioned to the Bureau of Transportation in 1960. That was a pretty substantial change because the Bureau of Transportation only dealt with the routes and scheduling and payment of the rail carriers for the services they provided for railway post offices and for storage mail, while the postmasters at major cities, or the endpoints of any of the railway post offices, ended up being responsible for the personnel. So up until 1960, personnel and the route management was all within the Railway Mail Service or Postal Transportation Service. Now, during most of the 20th century, there were 15 Railway Mail Service and Postal Transportation Service divisions. That's really not too important to anybody, except if you're doing postal history research, because Well, you need to know which division you're focusing on if you're going to do some postal history research involving railway post offices. So the schedules of mail routes, and then later on schemes of mail distribution for states. Schedules of mail routes were issued for each division several times every year beginning in 1877. They were essentially like the employee timetable of a railroad employee, except they were published primarily for the railway postal clerks. And if you were a postmaster, you might have also had a schedule of mail routes so that you knew when your mail trains were operating. The general schemes that I mentioned, not shown on the slide here, they were issued every 3 or 4 years, and they were updated in corrections from general orders that were issued every week. So, what did a railway post office do? This is an advertisement from 1944. I believe it's from the Saturday Evening Post. At one end of the car or the other end of the car, you had pouches or sacks stacked between stanchions. It was either mail that was waiting to be worked or it was mail that was already worked and was going to be put off at stations. There was rarely any mail that was going from point to point that was just carried in a railway post office car that was not being worked. Space was too valuable. So that typically got loaded into storage mail cars. So if you look at a photograph of a train on a larger route, you'll typically see a railway post office car, and then you see a storage mail car next to it, which most railroad people call baggage cars. Really not a correct nomenclature. Where my cursor is sort of circulating around, these are letter cases. In a full-length RPO car of 60 feet, there were 1,088 cells, separations, and you had about 6 clerks or 7 clerks working 3 or 4 on each side, sorting letters according to whatever their scheme assignment was. And then right here, you had a registered mail clerk. He was the only one that really had a stool to sit down on because he had to write up receipts for all the registered mail that was received or being dispatched. And of course, the clerk in charge grabbed that stool near the end of the run to sit down and work on their own reports. But pretty much what you see is everybody standing. And in fact, for most of the run, everybody was standing the whole length of the trip. There was no sit down time. There was no rest bar time that they have in post offices. None of that. Okay, so down in this area here are the racks. They had pouches and then sacks and bundled letters called letter packages put into pouches for dispatch. And then here where they're dumping out newspapers and small parcels, if the small parcels had special handling endorsements on them and additional postage, they were being worked in this area here. The overhead boxes just provided additional separation space. And this fellow here is removing the contents of an overhead box into a sack and making that ready for dispatch. And then this is where you have other pouches and sacks that are being worked or they're ready for dispatch. Here they've got this thing called the picker-upper. Well, not really the best term, but I guess if you're going to be showing this advertisement to the general public, they don't know what a mail crane is or a catcher arm is or a cinder guard or anything like that. But this is a style of the catcher mail crane that was used on the New York Central system. The clerk has the mail crane in the up position ready to snag that pouch. So for that reason, this is one of the things that I really like about this ad. It visually depicts all the parts of a railway postal clerk, and it provides a good lesson as far as the varied activities that were going on in a car. Now, the other important takeaway for this particular advertisement was it was a series of these advertisements was for the 20th Century Limited. Very luxurious train. This is after the new 20th Century Limited was introduced with new equipment in 1938. It really looked nice, and your hoi polloi traveled by the 20th Century Limited. It was a sleeping car only train. There was no coaches, had a barber shop on board, had a stenographer, had a bar in addition to an observation car, as well as a full diner. If you remember seeing Cary Grant and Eva Marie Saint, who I understand just recently turned 100 years old, on the 20th Century Limited in North by Northwest, that's the kind of train it was. And it was a wonderful train. But the whole message of this advertisement was other ads showed like this. It showed the dining car, it showed the sleeping cars, it showed the observation car, and so on. The emphasis in this ad was that no matter how rich you were, no matter how famous you were, you could not put step into this car. You had to be an employee of Uncle Sam. These are not railroad employees in the picture. They are railway postal clerks. They are postal employees. And so, no matter who you are, you could not go into this car. But mail did travel first class on the 20th Century Limited. Anyway, the railway post office enabled en route distribution of several classes of mail, mainly first class letters, second newspapers, and fourth parcel post. Some people will think, oh, well, first class letters, that's probably the most important mail there was. Some people will say, wrong. Newspapers, because people were getting newspaper subscriptions and they expected a newspaper to arrive on a specific day because they paid for it, they would write their congressman if they started getting their newspaper a day late. So newspapers, in many respects, got almost preferential service over first-class letters. But notwithstanding, the whole sorting objective was the mail route that would get the letter or the newspaper or the parcel post or special delivery would get it to that post office at the earliest possible time. A real simple, straightforward service objective. None of this 2-day this, 3-day that, overnight or something else. Now, a lot of times airmail was frequently diverted to railway post offices during inclement weather. And of course, earlier in airmail history, there were relatively few airmail stops in the USA. So if you mailed a letter in some place like Lynchburg, Virginia, which did not have an airport, it traveled by a railway post office, probably to Washington, D.C., where it got onto a plane and then went the rest of its trip or most of its trip. Out in Denver, that was a mere airmail hub, but any of the other surrounding areas around Colorado, most likely that airmail traveled by a railway post office to get it to Denver for dispatch onto a plane. And of course, registered mail, which was a service of first class, was under the care of one clerk. If you ever have mail robberies, it was the registered mail that people were trying to steal, because currency for the U.S. Treasury and Federal Reserve and coin from the U.S. Mint all traveled as registered mail. James Cagney in White Heat opens with a scene of a robbery on the Southern Pacific that I think is sort of a reference to the 1923 D'Outremont brothers robbery, and maybe it was 1924. I'm not looking at notes right now, but in any event, where they dynamited the rail car and so on like that. That's pretty much what Jimmy Cagney and his crowd was doing. And that 8 minutes gives you a little bit of a view of what a mail train robbery was like. As I mentioned in that cutaway view, the crews of railway mail clerks staffed RPOs. They were post office department employees. The other thing was that they were also at stationary locations called transfer offices and terminals. Not to be confused with a railroad terminal. The post office terminals were adjacent to railroad stations, and that's where mail that could not be worked on railway post offices, as well as a lot of parcel post, was actually sorted. The average trip length for a 60-foot RPO crew was about 300 miles. And I give an example in Virginia, but you've got the Kansas City and Albuquerque and Los Angeles. And those were split up into east and west divisions. So, each of those was about 300 to 400 miles. Crews also had an additional 2 to 4 hours of advance time before departure of the initial terminal. They were on duty for, 10, 12 hours, not uncommon, standing most of the way. And certainly for railroad employees, the locomotive engineers only traveled about an average of 100 miles in an engine crew district. And then the passenger crew, which was the baggage man, the conductor, the flagman, brakeman, they traveled a shorter distance, but the railway post office crew topped them all with about 300 to 400 miles. A real photo postcard example. You can see that there's a railway post office car in this picture. You can see a derailment. I worked for railroads for a while, and one of the problems that you have in running on snow, especially if it's steep snow, is the flangeways may possibly get blocked with snow. Next thing you know, you're not riding on the rail anymore, you're riding on the snow. My thinking is the person who's in the RPO car door, which is a full width apartment of the car, that's one clerk. And I think the guy who's similarly dressed on the ground is the other railway postal clerk, got out just to sort of take a closer look at the situation. So it would have been likely that you'd have two clerks on this route at this time. I can make a guess about the names of the people based upon the schedules, but would not know which one is which. The issue is this card doesn't have any information. You look at the back of the card, it just says mail car. There's no clues other than what you see in the photo as far as figuring out where this was taken. You got three clues. It's something HO and Northern on the railway post office car, and that it's car number 25. Then you got 102 on the tenders, so you know what the locomotive number is. If you could identify every locomotive that ever existed and what railroad it was on, you'd probably find quite a few 102s. And then over there on the engine cab, it's got some lettering, but you just really can't make it out very well. At least I couldn't when I first started looking at this card. So what we're going to do is we use three primary sources to research this card. We use the Official Guide of the Railways from 1910, a railway mail service schedule for the 13th Division from 1909, and a post route map for the state of Idaho. Now, the second two came into play only after I could identify what railroad it was likely to be. So as I mentioned, the railway post office car, you can make out the HO. It wasn't quite obvious to me, the lettering on the locomotive cab, even when I bought the card and then did a very high resolution scan, that I could make out what that first letter was. But I could tell that the next letter or next character was an ampersand. And then it looked like I something and then something something. So started looking through the index for the official guide. This is really how I did it. And looking for something where an ampersand was in the second position and the route name ended with HO and then Northern, because I knew that much. And you just go down, you look down the list, and there's a lot of things don't match. They don't have the ampersand in the right place. They may have Northern, but they don't have a name in front of the Northern, until you get down to the Pacific and Idaho Northern, which I've enlarged that. It was a 4.5, standard gauge railroad, and that appears on page 717 in the official guide. So this is just how you do research. You start out with something that has no real documentation, and you start digging into it, and you start adding value to that item by doing the research. Looking at page 717, I see that there's a P&IN railway, and P&IN, yeah, that's pretty close to what it actually says on the cab. Could be pretty much what it says on the cab. And then I was evaluating that further, and the P&IN operated from Weiser to Evergreen. And It connected with the Oregon Short Line Railroad in Idaho, a very mountainous area of Idaho. Now, in the 13th Division Schedule of Mail Routes, you get a little more information. It had basically, now this is in May, but the train obviously was not a nice sunny day in springtime. The trains left out of Weiser at 10 o'clock in the morning, went to Evergreen, Idaho. NO means no office at 1:35, and then returned at 2:35 and got back to Weiser at 6 o'clock. NJ for council means that there's no junction. Apparently there was either some railroad or some sort of connection there, but it was not a junction of mail routes. It says that it's a 20-foot car. If you look up at the top, it says O.I. Ellis and Victor Dickey. In 1909, those were two railway postal clerks assigned to this run. RC means railway clerks. So you get a lot to go on by going to the schedule. And if you wanted to pursue Ancestry.com kinds of genealogical research, maybe you get lucky and you'd find a photograph of Ellis and Dickey to see what they look like and maybe identify them in the picture. But this is about as far as I went for that, just to know the schedule. If you look at the times and you look at the distance involved, that's about averaging 25 miles an hour. This train did not move fast. When you're driving your car through a city, typically you have a 25 mile an hour speed limit. When you're going the distance from Weiser to Evergreen, that may seem awful slow when you're just plodding along at 25 miles an hour. Chances are in the snow, it was running even slower than that. Now, if you look at an Idaho post route map from 1930, and there weren't many changes between 1910s and 1930s, you can get a visual representation. This is going through, as I said, a mountainous area of Idaho, pretty isolated. Evergreen was the name for New Meadows, the postal name for New Meadows. And then there was a stagecoach connection at that end. In later years, that stagecoach connection went further north. So that's the lay of the land. Then you get down here. Oh, well, now that you know that it's Idaho and that you are aware that that's obviously a wintertime view, you start doing some newspaper research. Newspapers, in my opinion, are not primary source material. I reserve primary source for something that is authoritative. Newspapers sometimes have editorial or reporter bias. Sometimes they don't get the facts right the first time. I won't go so far to say fake news, but just because it appears in the newspaper is not quite the same standing as being something that appears in the official register or in the schedule of mail routes or general scheme of mail transportation or in general orders or any of those other things, or the official guide. This one, I'm not going to read it to you. You can read it yourself. It's an account that appeared in the Coeur Press on January 7th, 1910, which is about the time period that we're looking at, that apparently there was a widespread blizzard that covered most of Montana. And of course, if it's in Montana, it's probably going to cover part of Idaho as well. So trains were delayed, trains were buried in the snow, and if you did not know much else, you're going to probably come up with a dating of around 1910, around January 7th, for this particular card. That same postcard photographer apparently walked around to the other side and took another view. Here, it would have been no problem if I found this one first. You got the fireman sleeping in the cab, looks like. He's just sort of sitting there with his hat down and trying to keep warm, probably. But, you can clearly see P&IN Railway. If you compare this to the other view, you'll see that the perspective and the placement of the cars is just about the same. The Pacific and Idaho Northern only had one railway post office and baggage car or express car, and then it had one coach. That was the entire consist of the train. Not many people were traveling during the winter, but if you wanted to go to Council or you wanted to go to Evergreen, this train was really the only way to get there. Of course, that card is not postmarked on the Evergreen and Weiser. If it had been, this is the postmark that you might have seen on that card or any other card that was mailed on that railway post office. Now, the notes pages show some other sample postmarks, courtesy of Rick Guns of the Mobile Post Office Society. This is a nice clear postmark on a postcard about the same time. This is December 17th, 1910. So if it was the other one was January of 1910, this is about 11 months later. What I've demonstrated here, yes, we really have reached a conclusion. I wanted to point out that you could start out with a card that may be generic, doesn't have much information, and if you really devote some postal history research to it, and it took a lot of time to get to what you saw in just a few minutes here, you can come up with a very well-documented post office historical image. Now, there are only a limited number of these P&IN railroad pictures anywhere, and most are a lot later than this photograph. Although the Railway Mail Service Library doesn't buy cards to enhance their value, that has been accomplished by doing this research. You start out with a $10 card, which, $10 could also be paying for other things at the library. But now that you've got fairly good documentation about it, if it were put up on auction, and you got people who are interested specifically in the Pacific and Idaho Northern Railroad or Oregon Short Line or later on the Union Pacific Railroad, you could probably get some more active bidding than what it was. But this is a moment frozen in time, a picture of just another day, and it finally gets, whatever history documentation it certainly deserves. So that's what you can do as postal history students. Now, if you want to open up mics, if anybody has any questions, we'll have at it.
Did they mark the mail that it was delayed in any way?
No, apparently not. You typically find the markings for mail. Sometimes mail is when it's delayed substantially, but the trouble is, in this era of 1910, you did not have mail delivery to every outlying post office daily. Some were once a week, twice a week, 3 times a week, and a delay of a few hours or a day or two. Everybody knew the snow was bad. So you didn't even need to go to, it was probably not even a newsworthy content for the local newspaper in Council or Weiser to publish anything about the derailment, because I understand the Pacific and Idaho Northern derailed frequently, and that's in good weather as well as bad weather. In the notes pages, there's a picture of the railway post office car standing on the track, but there's an embankment where the locomotive would roll off and go on down the embankment. What people consider to be news is awful hard to really ascertain. And if everybody local knew, oh yeah, the train derailed up the line and the winter weather was bad, you didn't really need markings on that mail. And of course, it's a little different on a branch line. Now, if you had a catastrophe where there was a fire, or if there was some other issue, then yes, you get those auxiliary markings on there. It says mail delayed and so on like that. Now, in large cities, I will say in large cities, they have some locations. I had a back stamp that says mail delayed, train late. Had the name of the railway post office, route, and the train number in the era when trains were late by an hour or two. In some cases, those kinds of markings were applied, but out in rural Idaho, that wasn't the practice. Maybe in a larger city where they had 2 or 3 mail deliveries a day rather than once or twice or 3 times a week, that was just a different realm that's largely forgotten today. Any other questions?
Were any postal employees on the trains armed?
They were not in this period. There was a spat of robberies that began in the 1920s. And I mentioned the Derailments brothers. I think that was 1923 up in Siskiyou Mountains of Oregon at Tunnel 13. What a lucky number that was. I think the train number was train number 13 too. So if I was the clerk, I probably would have marked off that day. But anyway, that one was the one that resulted in a nationwide manhunt. Then in 1924, that was followed by the Roundout robbery near Chicago, Illinois, where the train was held up and they made off with a large number of registered mails, some of which I don't think was ever recovered. At that point, the first reaction was the post office department got some 45 caliber revolvers that had been used during World War One that were surplus, got those transferred from the U.S. Army. And those things were heavy. If you're standing up for about 10 hours a day in a rocking car, those things get heavy on your belt. And at the same time, to discourage mail theft and robbery, they started posting Marines on the railway postal cars, which had a very simple order. They were ordered shoot to kill. If the crook doesn't drop his gun when you instruct him to say, drop your gun, you shoot to kill. There was no two ways about it. And one of the other instructions was the only way a mail robbery will succeed is if there's a dead Marine laying alongside. So very, very strict instructions. Now that lasted about a year or maybe less. And that was because if you're riding around in a car just carrying your gun, it's very boring. And nothing to do. You couldn't read a paper. You couldn't sit down. You had to be watching around. You had to be ready for the moment's notice that never really did come while the Marines were on guard. But, you know, it was a psychological impact that, hey, you're not going to mess with the U.S. mail anymore. Now, after that, then by about 1925, 1926, the Post Office Department procured some 2-inch barrel guns. Most of them were from Colt. They were called Banker Specials. They were 38 caliber. And every clerk had one. And this is until the 1960s. Then it was only if you were working the doorway, if you were the registered mail clerk, if you were the clerk in charge, then you had to have a revolver on your side. The rest of the clerks were relieved from that responsibility. So a lot of guns came out of service at that point in time. So they were not armed in the 1910s era. By the 1920s, they began to be armed, and they were armed all the way to the 1960s. And even on the last run of the New York and Washington, the clerks that worked the doorways, the clerk in charge, and the registered mail clerk still carried a firearm. I think at that point it became more of a reflection of pride, just like the Eagle badge was, that I was saying, you know, hey, I'm just not your average mail clerk. I'm really one of the top. Any other questions?
Not a question, but over at the Colorado Railroad Museum, they have one of these mail cars. And some years ago, my parents, my wife and I, and children went over there and went in that particular train. My mother was looking at it and she said, I think my brother was on this train because he worked on a railroad train and seemed to serve this period of time. So I thought that was a strange coincidence. But anyway, if anybody hasn't been to the Railroad Museum, you can see one of these mail cars. They are kind of interesting.
They are. There's a nice one up at the Sacramento Railroad Museum. It's Great Northern car number 42. What had been named the Orange Empire Railway Museum, it's called something else now, has Santa Fe car 60 down in the San Diego Rail Museum, which I guess is east of San Diego, about 60 miles. They have a railway post office car. I think that's Santa Fe number 74. There's some around. And of course, if you go to the Illinois Railway Museum, you have a 30-foot Burlington car that they demonstrate how to catch mail. So you can ride in the car. If you want to try your hand at the catcher arm, pick up a bag on the fly and dispatch one on the fly, they'll let you do it. So there's some opportunities around the country. Of course, the Chicago Museum of Science and Industry, that has the first Burlington Zephyr, the 9900, and there's a 30-foot apartment RPO car in there that you can look at through plexiglass. You can't really go into the car itself. And there's others around. To the point about the letter boxes, it's important to know that most railway post offices were not sorting mail only for the post offices along the line of which that train ran. They were sorting mail for post offices off the line, and sometimes in different states. Almost every RPO had what they called a states case, where you had a clerk that was just separating mail according to the state name, so that they could dispatch it to a railway post office car that was going in that direction. And then that's called primary distribution. Secondary distribution is when you start breaking the mail down within a state and sorting it to a specific post office and making up letter packages, all for, let's say, Denver, Colorado, or stations and branches of Denver, Colorado. So all of this was intended to keep mail from being worked more than one time, but in progressive steps and while the train was moving. That's really what the advantage of the railway mail service was. It could never compete with airplanes going coast to coast. What took almost 5 days by rail, airplanes could do within 2 days in the 1920s and 1930s, certainly by the 1940s, and more airmail routes were being added all the time. But that mail was carried in closed bags. It wasn't time or economically efficient to try to sort that mail en route. So, when the mail was traveling in a railway post office car, it got to the endpoint or to a connection, it was ready for dispatch. And that is one of the things that made the railway mail service so successful. Now, people say often that, well, the railway mail service doesn't exist anymore. It must have been a failure. No, not quite. The better way to view it is dinosaurs lived for millions of years and they're all extinct now, but anything that lives millions of years is a pretty successful species. And the railway mail service lasted for over 100 years. Mostly its an original form with some variations, some tinkering, and some improvements. So anything that lasts 100 years, by my way of thinking, is pretty successful. Just ponder how many things do you see in 2024 that are going to be around in 2124 in mostly the existing form. Heck, it's going to change in the next 10 years, not 100 years from now. So a lot to be proud of with the railway mail service, and the clerks who were associated with it were indeed very proud of their service. Many of them said, even into their later retirement years, if I could go back, I'd do it in a heartbeat. Now, of course, age catches up with all of us, but that was a sentiment back in the 1980s, maybe 1990s. Any other questions?
Well, thank you, Frank.
I appreciate the thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to present to you. I hope that you found something in this presentation to enjoy, and certainly you probably are walking away with more knowledge about the Pacific and Idaho Northern Railway than you ever realized up until this morning.